Tories and Iroquois, Wyoming Massacre 1778. In the heart of the American Revolution, a conflict of loyalties and a thirst for vengeance ignited a brutal chapter on the western frontier. Welcome to Histories and Native Tales. Subscribe for more captivating stories from the past. The year was 1778, and the flames of the American Revolution had engulfed the colonies. While battles raged on the eastern seaboard, a different kind of conflict was brewing on the western frontier of Pennsylvania. The Wyoming settlement, nestled along the Susquehanna River, had grown into a prosperous haven for settlers. 8 townships stretched across the valley, each populated primarily by families from Connecticut who had claimed the territory under original land grants from Charles II. The settlement embodied the American dream of a new beginning. Hardy pioneers and recent immigrants worked side by side, transforming wilderness into fertile farmland. Their wooden homes and barns dotted the valley floor, while fields of corn and wheat rippled in the summer breeze. Apple orchards climbed the hillsides, and livestock grazed in green pastures. 4 defensive forts stood watch over this pastoral scene: Fort Jenkins, Fort Wintermoot, Fort Forty, and Fort Wilkesboro. Their wooden walls and earthen reinforcements, though simple, had proven adequate protection against the typical threats of frontier life. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, a poisonous divide had taken root. The American Revolution forced every settler to make an impossible choice: independence or loyalty to the crown. This decision split the community down to its foundations, creating fissures that would never heal. Brothers took up arms against brothers. Fathers faced off against sons. Neighbors who had helped raise each other's barns now viewed one another with deep suspicion. Close friends became bitter enemies overnight. The conflict crept within the roofs and to the hearths and floors, destroying the bonds of trust that had held the community together. Family meals became tense affairs, with relatives careful to guard their words. Church services saw congregations divided, with patriots and loyalists refusing to worship together. Markets and taverns, once places of friendly gathering, turned into hotbeds of political argument and occasional violence. The settlement's commitment to the revolutionary cause came at a heavy price. 1,000 of its able-bodied men had enlisted in the Continental Army, leaving their homes defended by aging veterans and young boys. These volunteers represented the settlement's strongest and most capable fighters, their absence creating a vulnerability that would soon prove catastrophic. The remaining defenders worked to strengthen the 4 forts, but without adequate manpower, their efforts could only achieve so much. As tensions escalated, many settlers who remained loyal to the British Crown made a fateful decision. Rather than live among neighbors, they now saw as traitors, these Tories abandoned their homes and businesses. They sought refuge among the Iroquois Indians, who had forged their own alliances with the British. This exodus carried grave implications for the settlement's security. The Tories took with them intimate knowledge of the community's defenses, every trail, every ford, every weakness in the fortifications. They also carried deep resentment toward their former neighbors, a bitterness that would soon turn deadly. Among these Tory leaders was Colonel John Butler, whose story embodied the tragic nature of the conflict. Butler was no stranger to frontier warfare, having earned a reputation for both military skill and ruthlessness. But what made his position particularly poignant was his relationship with Colonel Zebulon Butler, his own cousin, who had remained in Wyoming Valley to become a respected Patriot leader. Their broken bond mirrored the larger conflict that divided the colonies, where the closest ties of family and friendship were sacrificed to opposing loyalties. In early 1778, the first warnings of impending disaster arrived through official channels. General Philip Schuyler, commander of the Northern Department of the Continental Army, received alarming intelligence from his native scouts. The Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca tribes were mobilizing in unprecedented numbers. Warriors gathered in secret councils, weapons were stockpiled, and war parties began moving through the forests. Schuyler, recognizing the grave threat, urgently wrote to Congress. His letters detailed the impending offensive against the western frontier and argued forcefully for preemptive action. He pointed out that it would require no greater body of troops to destroy their towns than to protect the frontier inhabitants. His military assessment was sound. A strong offensive could disrupt the enemy's plans and protect vulnerable settlements. But Congress, preoccupied with major campaigns in the East, failed to provide reinforcements. The Wyoming settlers would face what was coming alone. The settlement's vulnerability deepened when mysterious strangers began arriving under various pretenses. Some claimed to be traders, others said they were travelers seeking shelter. But their behavior raised suspicions among the watchful settlers. These strangers asked too many questions about defenses, troop movements, and store supplies. They were seen making detailed observations of the forts and mapping the surrounding terrain. Investigations uncovered evidence of a coordinated plot. Documents were found revealing communication with enemy forces. Maps showed defensive positions marked for attack. 20 of these infiltrators were arrested and sent to Connecticut for trial, while others were expelled from the settlement. This action, though necessary for security, further enraged the Tories. They saw it as unjust persecution of loyal British subjects and vowed revenge against their former neighbors. By June 1778, Colonel John Butler had assembled a formidable force in British-controlled territory. His army numbered 1,200 Tories, former neighbors and friends of the Wyoming settlers, now turned implacable enemies. These men had intimate knowledge of their targets and personal scores to settle. Joining them were 400 Iroquois warriors, led by the legendary Mohawk war chief Joseph Brant. Brant was a fascinating figure who straddled two worlds. Educated in English schools, he was as comfortable in British society as in his native culture. His diplomatic skills had helped forge the alliance between the Iroquois and the Crown. But it was his military prowess that earned him fame. His tactical genius, personal courage, and ability to coordinate warriors from different tribes made him a formidable enemy. The combined force moved through dense forest toward Wyoming Valley, their approach masked by the cover of wilderness and aided by expert scouts. The Indians launched a sophisticated deceptive campaign to mask the coming attack. Small parties visited the settlement professing friendship and peaceful intentions. These scouts mapped defenses, noted troop movements, and communicated with Loyalist sympathizers still living within the community. They observed daily routines, identified key leaders, and gathered intelligence on the settlement's weaknesses. Colonel Zebulon Butler, drawing on his military experience, recognized these visits for what they were: reconnaissance for an impending attack. He dispatched urgent letters to Congress and General Washington, detailing the settlement's vulnerability and requesting immediate reinforcements. But these desperate pleas never reached their destination. Tory spies intercepted the messages along the wilderness routes, leaving the settlement isolated and unaware of the full scope of the threat they faced. As June gave way to July, the tension in Wyoming Valley became palpable. The settlers tried to maintain their daily routines, tending crops, preparing for harvest, raising families, but an air of foreboding hung over every activity. Mothers kept their children close to home. Farmers worked their fields with weapons close at hand. The four forts, originally built to withstand typical frontier raids, now seemed woefully inadequate against the gathering storm. On July 3, 1778, the attackers emerged from the wilderness in full force. The sight of 1,600 warriors descending into the valley struck terror into the defenders' hearts. The Loyalist soldiers had disguised themselves with war paint, making them indistinguishable from their Iroquois allies. Only their officers, wearing British regimental uniforms, stood apart, a stark reminder of the Crown's backing for this mission of vengeance. The first target of the invading force was one of the smaller forts, defended primarily by Loyalist militia. Whether through prearranged treachery or sudden change of allegiance, Fort Wintermoot fell without a single shot fired. Its swift surrender provided the attackers with additional supplies and a strategic position overlooking the valley. The defenders at the second fort offered staunch resistance. A mix of Patriot militia and determined settlers fought tooth and nail against overwhelming numbers. The battle raged for hours as the defenders repelled wave after wave of attacks. But eventually, superior numbers prevailed. The fort was taken by storm, its capture marked by brutal violence. Only women and children were spared, their lives preserved in a rare act of mercy amidst the carnage. Colonel Zebulon Butler, watching the fall of the second fort from his position at Fort 40, faced a crucial decision. The fate of the remaining defenders rested in his hands. With careful deliberation, he ordered a strategic retreat. Leaving a small contingent to defend Fort Wilkesboro, he led 400 men across the Susquehanna River to Fort Kingston. There, the women, children, and other vulnerable settlers had sought refuge, their faces reflecting the growing fear as news of the earlier defeats reached them. Colonel John Butler, the Loyalist commander, recognized an opportunity in the chaos following the fall of the first two forts. He dispatched a message to his cousin Zebulon, proposing a parley to discuss terms of surrender. The offer presented Zebulon with an agonizing choice. As a military commander, he suspected a trap, but as a leader responsible for the lives of hundreds of settlers, he couldn't ignore any chance to avoid further bloodshed. After careful consideration, Zebulon agreed to the meeting, but with precautions. The parley would take place in an open field, a considerable distance from Fort Kingston. Distrusting his cousin's intentions, he insisted on bringing a substantial armed escort, 400 men, nearly the entire remaining garrison. These troops represented the settlement's last line of defense, a mix of Continental Army veterans, local militia, and raw recruits ranging from boys of 16 to men over 60. As Zebulon's force approached the designated meeting place, they found it deserted. In the distance, a flag fluttered at the foot of a mountain. When they advanced toward it, the flag-bearers retreated, claiming fear of treachery from Zebulon's side. The Patriot commander, determined to demonstrate good faith and secure peace, pressed forward with his men. This decision proved fatal. As they neared the flag's position, the true nature of the parley became clear. Loyalist and Iroquois forces, concealed in the surrounding woods, sprang their trap. They emerged from hidden positions, encircling Zebulon's men in a carefully orchestrated ambush. Despite the surprise, the Patriots fought with remarkable courage. For 3/4 of an hour, the battle raged with desperate intensity. Musket fire echoed through the valley as the defenders formed tight ranks, their disciplined volleys taking a toll on the attackers. At one point, their determined resistance seemed to gain the upper hand, pushing back against the encircling forces. Then came the moment that turned the tide. A cry rang out from within the Patriot ranks. The colonel has ordered a retreat. Whether this call came from fear or deliberate treachery remains unknown. Its effect, however, was devastating. Confusion spread through the ranks. The carefully maintained formation began to waver. The attackers seized their advantage. Their war cries filled the air as they surged forward, breaking through the now disorganized Patriot lines. What had been an organized battle devolved into desperate individual struggles for survival. Colonel Zebulon Butler shouted orders, trying to restore order, but the chaos was complete. Only Zebulon and about 70 of his men escaped the slaughter. They fled in different directions into the surrounding wilderness, carrying news of the disaster back to the remaining forts. Zebulon himself made his way back to Fort Kingston, where he would face the hardest decision of his command. The next day, the combined Loyalist and Iroquois forces surrounded Fort Kingston. Their numbers had swelled with their victory, their confidence high. They sent a chilling message to demoralize the defenders. 196 bloody scalps, taken from their fallen comrades in the previous day's battle. Under constant fire throughout the day, the defenders of Fort Kingston watched their situation deteriorate. As night fell, Colonel Zebulon Butler made a difficult choice. Recognizing the hopelessness of their position, he decided to attempt an escape. Under cover of darkness, he led his family and a small group of survivors out of the fort, making their way downriver to possible safety. He would prove to be the only officer to survive the Wyoming Massacre. Command of Fort Kingston fell to Colonel Nathan Dennison, who faced an impossible situation. Most of the garrison lay dead or wounded. Supplies ran low. The sight of their comrades' scalps had shattered morale. When Colonel John Butler offered a chance to discuss surrender terms, Dennison had no real choice but to accept. Dennison approached the Loyalist commander under a flag of truce, hoping to negotiate terms that would at least spare the lives of the remaining defenders. John Butler's response was brutal in its simplicity: the hatchet. This curt reply left no doubt about the fate awaiting the garrison. With no alternatives left, Denison surrendered Fort Kingston unconditionally. The attackers showed no mercy. They separated their prisoners into groups. Some were taken alive for uncertain fates. The rest were herded into houses and barracks. The buildings were then set ablaze, the attackers watching with satisfaction as flames consumed their victims. Screams echoed through the night, gradually fading as the fires did their work. Fort Wilkesboro, the last remaining stronghold, faced its fate next. Its garrison, depleted by casualties and desertions, had witnessed the destruction of the other forts. They had seen the smoke rising from Fort Kingston, heard the screams of their dying comrades. Their morale was shattered, their situation hopeless. In a desperate bid for mercy, the Wilkesboro garrison surrendered without conditions. They opened their gates, hands raised in submission. Any hopes for clemency were quickly dashed. The attackers swarmed into the fort, their bloodlust undiminished by their previous victories. Among the captured defenders were approximately 70 Continental soldiers, men specially recruited to defend the frontier. These professional soldiers had fought bravely throughout the campaign. Their reward was a gruesome death, butchered with calculated cruelty by their captors. The remaining defenders, along with women and children, met the same fate as those at Fort Kingston, locked in buildings that were then put to the torch. The violence extended beyond human targets. The attackers turned their attention to the settlers' livestock, displaying a particular savagery. Some animals were simply shot, others were subjected to cruel mutilation, their tongues cut out, leaving them to suffer lingering deaths. This destruction of essential farm animals ensured that any survivors would face starvation in the coming winter. Individual acts of cruelty marked the massacre's final hours. Captain Bidlack, captured during the fighting, endured particularly brutal treatment. His captors stripped him naked and drove splinters of pine knots into his body. They then piled more pine knots around him and set them ablaze. His fellow officers, Captains Ranson and Durgee, were thrown alive into the flames and held down with pitchforks when they tried to escape. The returned Tories, who had once lived among the settlers, showed special brutality toward their former neighbors. Their intimate knowledge of the community allowed them to target specific families for revenge. One Tory, whose mother had remarried, murdered his own mother, stepfather, sisters, and their infant children. Another, who had previously threatened his father's life, systematically killed his entire family. Father, mother, brothers, and sisters all fell to his hand. Survivors of the initial massacre, mostly women and children, fled into the surrounding forests. They faced a desperate journey through wilderness without food, shelter, or protection. Many perished from exposure, starvation, or exhaustion. Others fell victim to prowling bands of attackers who continued to hunt through the woods. Their bodies were left unburied, prey for wild animals. When the attackers finally withdrew, they left behind a scene of total devastation. The once prosperous Wyoming Valley had been transformed into a wasteland. Burned buildings smoldered where farms and homes had stood. Fields ready for harvest had been put to the torch. The few survivors emerged from hiding to find their community destroyed, their families slaughtered, their possessions looted or burned. The Wyoming Massacre stood as one of the American Revolution's darkest chapters, demonstrating the war's power to destroy not just armies, but entire communities. The settlement's destruction highlighted how quickly civilization could descend into savagery when the bonds of community were broken by political division. The personal nature of the violence, neighbor killing neighbor, family member murdering family member, left wounds that would never fully heal. The massacre's impact extended far beyond Wyoming Valley. News of the atrocities spread throughout the colonies, serving as a chilling reminder of war's human cost. The systematic destruction of a peaceful settlement, the deliberate targeting of civilians, and the intimate betrayals involved made Wyoming a powerful symbol of the revolution's human toll. The valley's fate demonstrated that in civil war, the deepest wounds often come from those who were once closest. Subscribe to Histories and Native Tales for more immersive journeys into the past, where we uncover the hidden narratives and untold stories that have shaped our world.